First item in the name of Deputy Desi Ellis to ask the Minister for Transport, Tourism and Sport his concerns expressed by taxi drivers regarding the decals required on the side of their vehicles. The Deputy, you have 4 minutes for your initial statement.
Minister, since the taxi industry review and the announcement of a host of reforms and new regulations, a number of problems have arisen for drivers trying to make a living and operate within the law. Some of these problems were not obviously going to arise, but some were fairly clearly going to come up, and taxi drivers were telling us this from the word go. Some of these issues have been again brought to my attention by taxi drivers who feel they are getting nowhere with the regulatory authority of the NTA and the Taxi Advisory Committee. One such issue which is raised across the board is the taxi decals, which were brought in for the side of cars. These were hailed as a security measure to stamp out rogue taxis operating without a proper licence, and also to give confidence to passengers, but they have done neither. It is of course important that prospective customers can tell that a car driving by is a taxi for hire. But it is now the case that a taxi driver cannot use their car in any private circumstance and not have people assuming that they are applying for hire. In the past, taxi drivers were able to remove their signage and place it in the boot or elsewhere and drive their car on their day off or on holidays as a private car. They were able to park up in towns or at their home and not be seen from a distance to be a taxi. To some, this might not seem important, but for those who make their living as a taxi driver, it is crucial for safety and comfort. Now we have these decals, and now a taxi is never not a taxi. This puts taxi drivers at risk for a number of reasons. I will illustrate the scenarios in which this becomes a problem. A car parked outside a home advertising to the world that is a taxi due to its decals is a beacon to criminals who can expect the car or the home to have cash in higher sums than normal. This is the case when parked on the streets, as taxis are more likely to have a stash of cash, expensive equipment or other things. It also provides information to anyone who might wish to clone the driver's licence. You can now quite easily find out a person's address from these decals. You may be a customer or you may be someone just passing down the street. One driver showed me how it was possible to change the name of the driver attached to a certain car with use of the app and details from the decal and plate. Some people have had their details available after they have even passed away. One driver I spoke to had refused to use the decals on his brand new luxury car, which he invested in for his business, but was worried that it would be damaged by placing the decals on it, and that would lose him money on resale. The decals also cause problems when the car is used in a foreign country or even across the border, drawing attention from potential undesirables or the police who may be confused. One driver told me of driving to a town on a weekend night with his family and having people attempt to enter his car or flag him down in the street. Fortunately, nothing more happened, but it is not unusual for drunken people to cause problems for taxi drivers when they refuse to pick them up. You only have to read the paper to see that taxi drivers are often victims of violent crime. We need our taxis to be identifiable. We need them to carry relevant information for customers and security. But we cannot allow them to be safe in their jobs and in their private life. There is also issues with insurance because of these decals. Also, taxi drivers are finding it incredibly difficult to find information on the regulations affecting them from the NTA or Advisory Committee. They don't know who to ask, and they get very little response when they ask questions. Drivers need more supports to access grants needed to increase wheelchair accessible vehicles and to stay within regulations. One driver I am dealing with was awarded a wheelchair access grant, was unable to take it up until he had raised the money he needed. When he did raise the money, he could not find out the grant was still available to him. There is a major communication problem, and it is causing serious morale problems with drivers, increasing frustration. This is seen in the lack of knowledge among drivers what can be done with a licence when the driver is deceased and a family member might want to keep it on.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. I ask the Minister for Transport, Tourism and Sport to reply.
Thank you, Cahir. Thank you, Deputy. The regulation of the small public service vehicle sector is a matter for the NTA pursuant to the Taxi Regulation Act of 2013. This includes responsibility for signage. As such, I do not have a function in this matter. I can, however, set out some background and some information in relation to the operation of the scheme which has been provided to me by the National Transport Authority. The requirement for taxi branding arises from the relevant recommendation of the Taxi Regulation Review Report, which was published by this government in January of 2012. The Taxi Regulation Review Group who prepared this report included representatives of the taxi industry, as well as representatives of the hospitality industry, consumer interests and disability groups. Action 31 of that report sets out the recommendation to introduce distinctive branding of taxis and wheelchair-accessible taxis. It further sets out that this will take the form of semi-permanent decals applied to the vehicle body, potentially to the doors on either side of the vehicle. The report identified issues with the current reliance on the road sign as the primary means of taxi identification, and stated that, and I quote, "Given the varied fleet, a degree of uniform branding would serve to better identify the licensed vehicle to the consumer, while ensuring that the professional operator make the same level of investment and commitment to the industry." Branding is an issue which was given extensive consideration before its adoption by the review group and subsequent endorsement by government. A prescribed livery, often including prescribed vehicle types or permanent roof signage, is a common feature of taxis internationally. Regulations were introduced by the NTA which required that since the 1st of January of 2013, taxis must have the prescribed vinyl self-adhesive external branding affixed to the front doors of vehicles. The current SI containing this requirement is the Taxi Regulation Small Public Service Vehicle Regulations of 2015, SI 33 of 2015. While I do recognise that taxis are privately owned, they are being licensed to provide a public service, and the condition of operating as a public service taxi vehicle is that the vehicle is branded in accordance with legislation now there. There have been a very small number of complaints that the imposition of a branding requirement renders the vehicle identifiable as a taxi at all times. It is acknowledged by me and the NTA that the imposition of a decal on the side of a vehicle does render it more visible as a taxi. However, it's still the case that even when the roof sign is removed, the vehicle is always identified as a taxi through the prescribed tamper-proof discs that are affixed to the front and rear windscreens at licensing stage. Of course, one of the additional benefits of the new taxi signage is that it's more difficult for vehicles to operate illegally as taxis. As the door signage is semi-permanent, the vehicle is still identified as a purported taxi even when the roof sign was removed, which wasn't the case previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy, you have 2 minutes.
Well, Minister, you keep kicking the touch to the NTA and saying that the NTA are the ones that lay down the rules. But this was pointed out back at the review group at the time, that this would cause problems. And I don't see why there's a problem in allowing people to have decals that can be taken away and put aside instead of having them permanently on the vehicle. Because one of the biggest issues we have in this country is burglaries and thefts from vehicles. And taxis are a big target when it comes to that. Taxis parked outside houses, if they're not there and their signage and people know that they're not there, they'll be out at work in the night time in a lot of cases. So people know that they're not in their houses. And I think it's, we have another example where a driver going across the border and the PSNI pulls him over and says, you can't, I don't think it's wise to be driving that car here in certain areas. I think, there are health and safety and other issues that are involved here, and the issues of the right for a person to drive their own car and their families. Because people come up, when they pull up somewhere at traffic lights or otherwise, they're trying to open doors when they see the decals. The right sign, the sign off the roof is gone. What is the problem in going back to that? I don't see a major problem. I just think that we dug our heels. Hackneys, limousines, all these don't have to do it. Why should taxis have to do it? I'm asking you to go and talk to the NTA. And, we also have an issue with insurance companies who are saying because of the decals, they will not give private insurance and they will not give social or domestic insurance. So we have a problem which we never had. And it means that a person has to have a second car in many cases, or their family have to have a second car. I think it's an outrageous expense. And we brought in some rules like the 9-year rule, which I never could see any sense in. But anyhow, cars were NCT'd. We have it in America and other places where some of the cars are 20 and 30 years old. Some of these rules that were brought in never made sense. And anyone who's coming into the industry as new has to have a 1 to 4 year old car. That is huge expense. That is excluding a lot of people in working class areas who cannot afford the expense.
Thank you, Deputy. Thank you, Minister, to conclude.
Thank you. But Deputy, you would be the very person who would come in here and criticising regulations if they were not playing a role in reducing the illegal use of vehicles within the taxi industry. It is absolutely the case. And you made the assertion there a moment ago that the Taxi Advisory Council is not playing a role in relaying on information and consulting with the industries. Well, I'd invite you to go and tell that to the unions that are represented on the Tax Advisory Council. And I think they'll find it very interesting that you've made that assertion here in the Dáil. We have a Taxi Advisory Council that has on it the very bodies and unions that are elected to represent the taxi drivers. It is a very large body. Its breadth is precisely designed to facilitate organisations to pass feedback onto the NTA. Now, if you don't feel that's adequate, or if you have an issue about that, I'd invite you to go and talk to the unions that are on that body who are engaging with the NTA on this and other matters. And the point that you have made there in relation to the impact that this signage does have on vehicles, I do accept the point, of course, that it does make clear that that vehicles have been are being used exclusively for or mostly for the purpose of being a taxi. But Deputy, the very reason that is happening is to respond back to concerns that the taxi industry had in relation to illegal use and in relation to concerns that they had regarding the quality of cars that were being there and difficulties that they were facing in relation to the reputation and to the growth of their industry. So this very regulation is in place to try and make the taxi industry, to give it the regulatory framework and support it needs to grow safely. And if it wasn't in place, Deputy, you'd be coming in here and criticising me for it not being there.
Thank you very much, Minister. Second topic.